Hi friends, welcome to our tutorials. This is part 3 of Angular interview question and answers. In this section, we will cover about all the interview questions that are asked about modules and components. Before we get started, if you haven't checked out our first two parts, please do so you get the foundation and understanding of some of the important fundamental concepts. If you like the video, please like, share, subscribe to my channel to keep supporting and encouraging me. Thank you so much. Let's get started with part 3. What are Angular modules? Angular modules are the logical boundaries in our application. The application is always divided into certain modules to separate the functionality of our applications. For example, a users can be one module, dashboard can be another module, and so on. So the application is logically divided into multiple modules, which are easy to manage and easy to maintain. The modules are created using the Decorator NG module. And NG module has three options in it. One is the import section, one is the browser module, then there is declaration, and there is bootstrap. So which tells our application what to start and where to find the required modules. Let's take a quick look at our code to learn. So the important module is app module, and similarly there can be many more modules in our application. I have created multiple in my app project here to explain you better. So we have a module called FW. You can see here FW module.ps file. Similarly, you can have any number of modules and components belong to modules, and you import this particular newly module into your app.module. So let's look at that app.module. So we see we have imported ng module, which is the core and the most important aspect. Inside the ng module, we have declarations where we import our components. Once we have imported the components, the modules, the modules are imported under imports array. We also have exports. If you want a certain module to be available throughout the application modules and components, we will specify them under modules. So remember, if most of the times if something is not working and it's not available, it's mostly because it is not available in the exports. All the services are injected under providers. That's what is line number 41 onwards. So this is again an array, and you inject all the services inside the providers. So this is how we define any module in our application, and there can be more than one module in the application. In fact, a good Angular application will be made of multiple modules which are smaller, easy to maintain, and easy to develop. That is about Angular modules. What is the default module bundler in Angular applications? So we have seen that there can be multiple bundling tools or packaging tools we can use in our Angular applications. The default module bundler is Webpack, which comes with Angular CLI project. So whenever we issue any command, anything that runs, it happens via Webpack. So if you just say ng serve, you can see that Webpack is used to build, to bundle the modules, and to compile and serve it. So that's Webpack, which does all the heavy duty work of bundling and building. So you can see here Webpack output. So currently the default bundling package manager is Webpack in the applications. The other packaging tools or module bundlers that we can use are Gulp, Babel, and Grunt. So what is ng module? ng module is a class which describes how the application parts fit together. One of the example we just saw was app.module and FW framework module that I've created. Every application at least should have one ng module, that is the app module, or the root module that we will use to bootstrap the application. So the question can be tricky sometimes, which can say, can you build an Angular application without a module? No, we cannot. We need at least one uh, module in our application, which has to be defined with ng module. In most cases, it is app module. What are the metadata for ng module? So we have seen this. ng module has multiple things that it can take as metadata, one of which is imports, declarations, bootstrap, export, and providers. An example of which can be seen here in our app.module.ts file. So here I have ng module declared, and we have declarations where we are importing all the components for this particular module. Similarly, we'll have imports array where we will import all the required modules. We can also have exports where we can export modules which we think are required for our application to be available to all the other components and modules. We can also have providers where we will inject the services which we need to make it available. Finally, we bootstrap. At least one ng module is required to bootstrap the application. Otherwise, it will not work. So those are all the metadata tags that are available for ng module. So the question now comes, how do we create a new module, right? Using Angular CLI. So let's see that in action now. All right, let's go to our application and I'll close this. All right, to create a new module in our application, we need to be at the root level, and then I will navigate to our source, and I'm saying ng generate module and then the module name, and I'm going to call this as, let's say we want to call any you can give any name to this module. There is no restriction. It depends upon what project you're trying to create. So I'm going to call it preferences. So I'm trying to build a module which will be preferences, which I can export and use it in multiple applications. Since modules are individually distributed, we can always use the same module in multiple applications. Let's generate this. So this is how you generate a new module. So we can see here it has created a new module under source preferences. You can see here that it has created a new module which has the same declaration ng module, declaration, imports. It will not have bootstrap because you will only bootstrap the application only once. So you can also add providers. This is again an array. You can add exports. Again, this will be an array. So we can add multiple things based on the requirement of our module, but this is how you generate a new module. Now, how do we export a component from a module? Include the component in the list of exports array. Now let's see, how do we see this? So why do we need to export components? When you want a particular component to be available into other modules or other application places, that's where we need to make sure that our component is totally exported, and that's when it will work. Let's see that in action. All right, so let's go back. So I have a module here which says framework FW. So I have few components which I have created inside this module, like content, menu, services, status bar, title bar, etc. So these components are created inside the module, which is what we have, framework module. Now, once we have this, now these are the components which are inside this particular module. To make a particular component available in other modules, we can just take the component name and add it to the list of exports. This way we can now make use of this component in app.module because the framework module is imported inside the app.module. So that way it can be available across all the application wherever we want to use this component. So that's how we export a component from a module. Again, friends, if you have any questions, queries, or if you're not sure about certain aspects of the topics that are covered, feel free to drop in your comments. I will try and help you as much as I can. All right, how do you add a new module into app module? So this is again the same thing. So we just saw that we have generated a new module called preferences.module. So the way we add it is we export this and add it into app.module, and we can just import it here and say we want a new module. It will give you underline saying that it did not find it. So for that, what we need to do is just hover it, quick fix, it will import it. So we can see here in the imports, now we have imported the module into app.module. So this is how you will import any newly created modules into your app module. All right, so this was all about the modules that mostly get asked. But if you have any certain questions or queries, drop me a note in the comment section and I will help you with that. Let's get now started with some of the frequently asked questions on Angular components. Before we proceed, friends, I will humbly request you to kindly subscribe to my channel to keep supporting me so that I can bring you educational tutorials for free. Thank you so much. All right, the first question that is asked is, what are Angular components? Components are the building blocks of any Angular application. Components are the most basic UI developing building blocks while developing an Angular application. These components will form a tree structure of Angular components. And these components are nothing but you can think of them as subset of directives. So component is a type of a directive, is a subset of directive. We will explore them in detail again. Unlike directives, components always have a template and only one component can be initiated per element in the template, which means you cannot have multiple templates for a component. You always need to have only one element per component. Let me show you an example. So this is our component, let's say country list. I go to component list.component.ts. You see the selector here. This is the element and only one element selector can be provided per component. You cannot have multiple things like this. It is not an array. This will be wrong. So only one selector per component. So this is how we generate the components. All right. Now next, explain component structure and building blocks. Right. Now each component has 5 different things that can be associated with it. One is the selector. Now selector is the name of the tag element that we want to associate the component in our application. Define the name, which is to define the name of the HTML element in our component. Now we can either provide template or template URL, which is nothing but the HTML view where we will bind the HTML element with the data of the components. We can have styles, which is nothing but style array of our specific component. We can also have external style sheets attached by using style URLs. Then we can also have a directive decorator defined for our components. We can also use providers. So providers usually are used in Angular services to tell where this will need to be injected, whether it needs to be in root or in a certain place. Let me show you with an example of each of these. So here we are seeing selector, which is nothing but the HTML selector tag name that we want to associate. Here we are putting template URL, which means I'm pointing it to the HTML file. We are using style URLs, so we can link the external CSS. Again, you see style URLs is an array, which means I can associate multiple style sheets. That is fine. So this is allowed since it's an array, but template has to be only single and selector has to be only single, only one. All right, let's put it back to correct. All right, now let's go back. All right, so that was about the component structure. Make sure you go through this again so you understand clearly about what exactly a component is made of, what the structure is, and how it looks like. Because this is something that if you explain it correctly, a lot of things will be clear because they will understand that you know the architecture, you know the component structure and details. All right. Now, one of the tricky questions that is asked in interviews is, can components be nested? That's one of the question that is asked. This is to trick you and to see whether have you built any complex components. So the answer is yes. We can have multiple nested components as long as they are clearly mapped to the modules and they are properly exported. Let me show you an example of the same. Now we have multiple components here that are there. Now we will show you. So you can see here component. So we can see here app menu is the menu which is coming from menu component, but it is called inside content component. So app menu is inside the content component. So this way you can have hierarchical structure and at any number of components can be arranged easily. So when they ask you can components be easily nested, the answer is yes, they can be easily nested, right? The next important question that is asked is explain @component decorator. Now by now you know that most of these are generated when we are generated through Angular CLI. Angular CLI generates for us, but let's see in detail how this @component decorator works. Using the @component decorator, we can define the components constituents like template URLs, style URLs, and selector name. An example of which is given here, which is component, and you have a selector, you have template URL, and we have style URLs. That is what we just saw in our example as well. Every component will have @component decorator will have selector, template URL, and style URLs. Using these, we can easily define a new component which we want and can be used in our module or in our throughout our application. All right, so the next important thing is how do you generate a new component? So this is using our Angular CLI. So let's see that in action. So for generating, we'll use the command ng generate component and component name. So once we do this, we will get our component generated automatically using Angular CLI. Time to see it in action. Let's see that. Alrighty, now we have here we are in source. So I am going back to the module that I just generated, which is our preferences. And inside the preferences, we will go and we will say ng generate component, and I'm going to give component name which says languages. So this way I'm generating a component inside the preferences module to save the languages of the user. So ng generate component languages. Now important thing here to note is it will generate the HTML file, the spec file which is our testing, component.ts which is our controller, component.css which is our style sheet for the component, and then finally preference.module.ts which is updating the preferences into the module.ts. So this is important because we have to tell the module that it exists. Now you can see the language component has been added into the declarations, without which it will not be available. So that is how you generate a particular new component inside the module. All right. Now this is a true or false question for you to see your understanding. Every Angular application at least have one component. True or false? Of course it is true, because at least one component should be present in the Angular application. The default one is app component. By default, there is an app component called app component which is generated and which is very much required when you are working with Angular applications. You can have more than one, but at least one is the requirement. This is again a tricky question to trick you during the interview, so don't get tricked. Every Angular application at least need one component. Now, this is an important, very, very important question. So please pay extra attention to this slide. Explain Angular component lifecycle. Now, Angular application goes through a set of processes, or what we call it as lifecycle, right from its initiation to the end of the application. That process is called component lifecycle. Now, each component lifecycle has a lot of methods in it. The first one is always ng on init, ng on changes, ng do check, ng after content init, content checked, and ng after view init, ng after view checked, and finally ng on destroy. Each of these methods needs to be implemented in our component class whenever you implement the interface. Now, mostly in most components, you would either use ng on init, ng on destroy, usually whenever you're subscribing, and also ng on changes. So these are some of the commonly used, most frequently used methods that you use of component lifecycle. Let me show you examples. All right. So let's go to this component. So we have a component called country list component, and then we are seeing that it is implementing ng on init. So we need to import on init from Angular core, and we have to mention it as export class country list component implements the lifecycle method. So here I am putting on init, but you can use any other lifecycle methods, like for example on destroy. Now it will give you error because we have not implemented. So let's implement that, and that error should go away. So property ng on destroy. So this is not on destroy, it is ng on destroy. So now you see we imported both implement ng on init and on destroy, and then we are implementing the two methods, which is ng on init and on destroy. We need to import them from Angular core. So these are two of the important component lifecycle methods that are mostly used, and you would run into these more often than not. Which means if you create anything with components, you will most probably use these two. So remember, whenever the interviewer will ask you about component lifecycle, you have to mention these 9 methods that are there. Go through these again, revise it, and you are asked about frequently used methods, you can explain few of them based on your experience. Before we move on, this is tricky. If you have any questions, queries, please do drop your queries in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to help you and provide you free advice and help. All right, let's move. What is the difference between constructor and NG on init? Now, this is yet another important tricky question that is asked by most interviewers, which is they want to know what is your understanding about constructor and NG on init. Now, let me show you example first before I explain you. So here in the previous question, we implemented NG on init and a constructor. So why do we need two different things? What is the purpose of each? And how does one use and where to use? Let's see that in detail. So TypeScript classes has a default method called constructor, which is normally used for initialization purpose. So this is just like if you are coming from object-oriented world, a constructor is good as any other class initiator when you create an object. That's the default method which comes with any class. Whereas ng-on-init method is specific to Angular, and most of the initialization or anything that starts in your Angular application should be kept inside ng-on-init. Even though constructor gets called first, it is always preferred and recommended that we move all our code into ng-on-init. So in order to use ng-on-init, we need to implement the ng-on-init interface, just like how we did here. Now we are implementing this interface here in the class, and this is required whenever we are implementing any of the lifecycle methods. How to add condition to ng class? Now this is yet another CSS related thing. Let's check it out in the template now. For example, so ng class is used to set a class for a component or an element. For example, in this particular condition, we are seeing that we are setting ng class based on a condition. If the vertical menu is true, then only you apply the class. That's what it is meaning. Otherwise, in regular HTML template, we'll write class equal to, but there is no way to set conditions. But here we can set conditions using ng class. Let's see that in action. So I'm going to one of my existing components menu item. So you can see here that, so I want you to focus on line number 2. So you see here we have added ng class directive and we have binded it, and we are checking that if vertical menu is set to true, then only you apply this class by the name vertical menu. So this is more of a if else condition before we apply this style, that is the class name, to the element. So remember, this resolves to true or false. If it is true, then only it will apply the class name, else it will not. All right, that was quite a bit of work today on modules and components. So we covered all the important questions, interview questions that are asked on modules and components. We will keep revising this list, but if you have any specific doubt, queries, please do drop in your queries and comments section. I'll be happy to help you. If you like the video, please hit on like button, share, subscribe, and don't forget to keep encouraging me by subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much. In the next part, I will cover in detail the questions on Angular decorators. Thank you so much for joining.